On the night of December 29, 1972, a modern marvel of aviation was making its way toward Miami. Eastern Airlines Flight 401, a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar jet, carried 163 passengers and 13 crew members. The flight had departed from New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport and was on its final approach to Miami International Airport. The passengers were looking forward to the warm Florida weather, many of them heading for New Year's celebrations. The crew was experienced, led by Captain Robert Loft and First Officer Albert Stockstill, with flight engineer Donald Repo also in the cockpit. The L-1011 was a new and advanced aircraft, considered one of the safest in the sky. As the plane prepared to land, the crew noticed a problem. The indicator light for the nose landing gear had not illuminated. This small green light was supposed to confirm that the gear was down and locked in place. Captain Loft decided to abort the landing and circle over the dark Florida Everglades to troubleshoot the issue. The pilots put the aircraft on autopilot at an altitude of 2,000 feet while they focused on the landing gear light. The entire cockpit crew became preoccupied with what seemed to be a simple, burnt-out bulb. They were so focused on this minor technical issue that they failed to notice a much more critical problem developing. The crew's intense focus on the landing gear light led to a catastrophic oversight. Unbeknownst to them, the autopilot had been accidentally disengaged. The massive L-1011 TriStar began a slow, gradual descent into the darkness below. Without any visual references over the pitch-black swamp, the pilots did not realize their altitude was dropping. There were no alarms or warnings from the cockpit systems that could have alerted them in time. The conversation in the cockpit was all about the small light bulb, while the aircraft silently flew closer and closer to the ground, its fate sealed by a moment of distraction. At 11:42 p.m., Eastern Airlines Flight 401 crashed into the Florida Everglades. The impact was devastating, as the jet disintegrated while traveling at over 200 miles per hour. The wreckage scattered across the swampy terrain, a scene of chaos and tragedy in the remote wilderness. Rescue efforts were difficult in the dark and inaccessible location. In the end, 101 people lost their lives in the crash, including Captain Loft, First Officer Stockstill, and Flight Engineer Repo. However, 75 people miraculously survived the disaster, left to grapple with the terrifying events of that night and the profound loss they had witnessed. In the months following the tragic crash of Flight 401, a strange and unsettling new story began to emerge. The tale did not come from the survivors of the crash, but from the employees of Eastern Airlines itself. Flight attendants and pilots started reporting bizarre encounters on other L-1011 TriStar jets in the airline's fleet. These were not just any jets. They were the planes that had reportedly been fitted with salvaged, undamaged parts from the wreckage of Flight 401. The airline had recovered usable components, such as galley ovens and other interior fixtures, and installed them on sister ships to save costs, a common practice in the industry. The reports were consistent and deeply unnerving. Flight crews claimed to see the ghostly apparitions of the deceased Flight 401 crew members. Most frequently, the figures of Captain Robert Loft and Flight Engineer Donald Repo were seen. A flight captain and 2 flight attendants swore they saw and spoke to Loft in the first-class cabin of a TriStar before he vanished. On another flight, a flight attendant saw the face of Don Repo looking out from a galley oven. When she called 2 other colleagues to see, they also saw the apparition, who reportedly warned them, "Watch out for fire on this airplane." These ghostly encounters were not limited to fleeting glimpses. Some reports describe detailed interactions. One flight engineer on a pre-flight check was startled to find Don Repo already sitting at the engineer's panel, seemingly performing the checks himself. The spectral figure allegedly told him, "You don't have to worry, I've already done it." In another instance, the captain of a flight to Mexico City reported seeing Repo, who pointed out a fault in an electrical circuit that was later confirmed by maintenance crews on the ground. The sightings were often helpful, as if the spirits were trying to ensure the safety of other flights. The stories spread like wildfire throughout the airline. Many employees were terrified, with some flight attendants becoming too scared to work on the specific aircraft where these events were reported. The apparitions were described as incredibly lifelike, not transparent or shadowy figures, which made the encounters even more frightening for those who experienced them. The ghosts of Flight 401 were not seen as malevolent spirits. Instead, they appeared as concerned colleagues from beyond the grave, forever tied to the L-1011 aircraft they had served on, watching over the living crews who now flew in their place. As the number of paranormal reports grew, Eastern Airlines found itself in a very unusual and difficult position. The company's management was faced with a growing crisis of morale among its flight crews. The stories of ghostly encounters were no longer isolated rumors, but were becoming a widespread phenomenon within the airline. Pilots and flight attendants were formally documenting their experiences in flight logs, forcing the company to acknowledge the issue. However, an airline is a business built on safety, logic, and public trust. Admitting that their planes might be haunted was simply not an option, as it could cause mass panic among passengers and severely damage the company's reputation. In response, the airline's executives officially denied the existence of any ghosts. They tried to discourage the spread of these stories and put pressure on employees to stop talking about them. According to some accounts, management threatened employees with dismissal or psychiatric evaluation if they continued to report paranormal activity. They wanted the entire matter to disappear quietly. The airline even started removing the salvaged parts from the aircraft, where the sightings were most frequently reported. All logbooks and records that mentioned the ghostly apparitions were collected and seemingly vanished from company records, an attempt to erase any official trace of the haunting. Despite the official denials and threats, the stories refused to die. In fact, the airline's attempts to suppress the tales only made them more intriguing to the public and the media. The legend of the ghosts of Flight 401 began to leak outside the confines of the airline industry. Books and articles were written about the phenomenon, capturing the public's imagination. The most famous of these was my own book, The Ghost of Flight 401, published in 1976, which compiled the numerous first-hand accounts from airline employees. This brought the story to a massive international audience, turning the tragedy into one of the most famous ghost stories of the 20th century. The public's reaction was one of fascination and belief. For many, the idea that the spirits of the dedicated crew were still looking out for the safety of their fellow airline employees was a comforting thought. It transformed a story of mechanical failure and human error into a narrative of enduring duty and care. The airline, however, continued to maintain its stance of denial. Frank Borman, the former astronaut who became the CEO of Eastern Airlines, publicly dismissed the stories as nonsense and ordered all salvaged parts from Flight 401 to be removed from the fleet. Yet the legend had already taken on a life of its own, becoming a permanent part of aviation folklore. The enduring popularity of the Flight 401 ghost stories raises a fascinating question. Why do such legends take hold so powerfully in the public consciousness? One of the primary reasons is that these stories provide a sense of meaning and order in the face of a random, senseless tragedy. The crash was caused by a simple distraction, a moment of human fallibility that led to immense loss of life. This is a deeply unsettling thought. The ghost stories reshape this narrative into something more mystical and purposeful. The idea that the spirits of the crew returned to protect other flights offers a comforting belief that their dedication did not end with their deaths. Furthermore, these legends serve as a powerful form of collective grieving and remembrance. By telling and retelling the stories of the ghostly sightings, people keep the memory of the deceased crew members alive. Captain Loft and Flight Engineer Repo are not just remembered as victims of a crash, but as heroic figures who continued their duties even after death. This narrative helps people process the tragedy by focusing on themes of loyalty and protection, rather than just the grim details of the accident. It is a way for the community, both within the airline and in the wider public, to pay tribute to the fallen crew and find solace in their imagined continued presence. The psychological element of suggestion also plays a significant role. Once the stories began to circulate, airline employees who flew on the planes with salvaged parts may have been more inclined to interpret unusual events as paranormal. A flicker of a light, a strange noise from a galley, or an unexpected face seen in a reflection could easily be attributed to the ghosts they had heard so much about. This is not to say the witnesses were dishonest, but rather that the power of suggestion can shape our perception of reality, especially when we are emotionally primed by a compelling and tragic story. The legend created its own evidence as it grew. Ultimately, the story of the ghosts of Flight 401 is more than just a ghost story. It is a testament to how humans use narrative to cope with trauma and loss. It reflects a deep-seated human need to find hope and continuity in the face of mortality. Whether the ghosts were real or a product of collective grief and imagination, their legend provided a sense of comfort, purpose, and enduring connection. The tragedy of Flight 401 was a story of a journey that ended too soon. But the legend it inspired became a timeless tale of spirits who, in their own way, made sure that others would complete their journeys safely.